Turkey's president has announced his invasion of northern Syria has begun as Kurdish forces move to defend the border. Turkey calls the Kurds terrorists, but the United States considers them an important ally and bulwark against terrorism.
They have been essential allies in our fight against ISIS. But a few days ago, President Trump announced that he'd be abandoning them, breaking an American promise and pulling out of the region to allow Turkey to attack.
For more on this, let's bring in CBS News State Department reporter Christina Ruffini. She's following the latest. In fact, I saw the news breaking over your Twitter feed. Christina, you were tweeting the Turkish President Erdogan, his tweet. Give us some background as to this. Why is Turkey making this excursion into northern Syria?
So if you remember in December, after another phone call with Turkish President Erdogan, President Trump tweeted he was pulling all troops out of Syria. There was a big uproar. Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis resigned, and that's because the prevailing wisdom then and now was as soon as the U.S. pulled out, the Turkish military would go in and essentially wipe out the Kurdish militia groups who had been U.S. partners in the fight against ISIS, but the Turks view as terrorist organizations. In the aftermath of that December announcement and the pushback from both Republicans and Democrats, as a way to kind of guard against that happening, the U.S. worked out this safe zone agreement with Turkey to create a buffer between the Turks and the Kurds that was jointly operated. Now Turkey is saying that's not enough. They want to create a bigger, possibly 30 to 60 kilometer space they control in northern Syria. They want to go in and clear out the area so they can reduce what they say is a terrorist threat from these Kurdish groups and possibly resettle as many as 2 million Syrian refugees back into this territory.
So I know the U.S. has tried to sort of differentiate between the Kurds within Turkey and the Kurds in Syria. But just take us back and explain why Turkey feels that these Kurds are terrorists.
So the SDF, which is the Syrian Democratic Forces, are a group of Kurdish militias, sorry, it's been a long morning, who have been basically the most effective forces against ISIS and really did the dirty work for the U.S. on the ground in these operations, and many of them lost their lives in the process. The Turks, however, have for decades been fighting Kurdish insurgency groups, especially a group called the PKK. The PKK has some political affiliation with, stick with me here, the YPG, which makes up the majority of the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF. So if you followed all that, the U.S. says these groups are different enough to support and fight alongside. The Turks says they're basically the same group with different jackets, and they still pose a threat to their territory.
So it's interesting. The president has been tweeting a lot about this in addition to tweets around the impeachment inquiry. He has clearly seen the blowback that he has gotten from not just Democrats, but this time from members of his own party. At one point suggesting that, there was just such a few number of American troops there, it wasn't that big of a deal. Just 50 troops, right? But those 50 were enough to prevent Turkey from making this excursion into the region. And so the question, of course, becomes, what does it mean long term for the United States? What is the State Department saying about how the United States will be perceived amongst our allies, amongst those that we count on to help us in our fight against the global war on terror if we can't keep our promise?
Well, it's not great. I mean, it's not a great look, because you have these people that we said, look, if you fight and die for us, we're going to have your back. And now we're saying, well, we don't really support what the Turks are doing, but we're going to get our guys out of the way just in case. It's an interesting number. So it's about 50. It's two small detachments, is how it was described to me by a senior administration official. The official actually looked around the room, and there were about 24 journalists, and he said it was, comparable to the number of people that we had in the room. So those troops are not going to be the big thing that keeps ISIS from resurging. But what they did do was keep our ally, Turkey, from going in and putting those troops in danger, because the Turks do not want to in any way harm U.S. forces. So now that they're out, the U.S. is essentially playing a game of chicken with the Turks, because the U.S. administration does not believe the Turks can go in and conduct this operation without U.S. Support on the ground or without U.S. air support. The American military currently controls the airspace in this area and have said they have no plans to relinquish that. So they're saying, okay, Turkey, you think you can do this? We don't think you should, but go ahead and do it. We're playing chicken and we're not going to flinch. The problem is there's other drivers on the road, including the Kurds, who have been our allies in this fight.
Yeah, there are a few other drivers on the road, and one group is ISIS. And you pointed out that the Kurds have been instrumental in suppressing ISIS in Syria. The president says ISIS has been defeated, but not everyone agrees with the president, including one of his supporters, Lindsey Graham, who said that that was the biggest lie told by the administration. What exactly is the situation on the ground in regards to ISIS?
Almost every other government official other than the president refers to it as the territorial defeat of ISIS, but not the total defeat, because the group and its ideology are still very much hanging around. And now there are splinter groups, including ISIS Khorasan, which is of particular concern and gaining strength in places like Afghanistan. It's true they don't hold the territory they once did, but they're still there and they still pose a threat both to the local population, regional stability, but also a real and active threat to the United States.
And the president, I mean, part of the criticism from lawmakers, including Lindsey Graham, around the question of ISIS is that many ISIS prisoners are being held in Kurdish prisons. So what happens if they are overrun or
if the Kurds find themselves having to fight the Turkish troops?
Right. And not being able to hold these ISIS fighters in their prisons. They're back out. They're back out there.
I mean, power abhors a vacuum, but terrorists love it. And if the Turks charge into northern Syria and the SDF, which has been holding, as you mentioned, not only territory, but thousands of ISIS fighters in these detention camps, as well as families and associated individuals that they would then have to abandon to fight back against the Turks, you could have a situation where not only are all these angry, detained fighters roaming around free, but if the U.S. is right and Turkey can't hold the territory on their own, they could be forced to fall back themselves and essentially cede this hard-fought ground to the group that poses the biggest threat to Turkey, the Kurds, and the United States.
And so we're out of time now, but we haven't even talked about what this means for Russia. That's another factor. And, of course, Assad. It's a complicated mess.
I mean, it does, Christina, the one thing that it's not clear to me, and I don't know, again, if what the State Department is telling you, is what's the president's strategy? I understand the political argument. He campaigned on pulling U.S. troops and taking America out of its longest wars in Afghanistan and the fights that we've been engaged in Iraq and across the Middle East. But what is the long-term strategy in doing this, in pulling these troops out? What is he hoping to accomplish?
I think he's hoping to get out. I think he's hoping to get out of these intractable wars, which, as you mentioned, is something he campaigned on. And there is an argument to be made that we have to stop existing in these status quo situations, right? The reason these troops were there was to balance the threat from the Turks, which was to help the Kurds stay in place, which was to push back ISIS. And we pull out one of those pins and it all kinds of collapses. The problem is, how long do you want to keep that pin there? How long is the U.S. willing to keep forces or keep a presence, even the relatively small one we had there, which is about 1,000 troops? And the president has made it very clear that he wants out. He wants out of all these conflicts. And it may cause problems, but he wants it done sooner rather than later. And it appears sooner was this week.
Wow.
All right.
Christina Ruffini, thank you.
Thank you.